Hello, and welcome to this Clinical Care Options podcast episode. This episode is a featured component of an educational program titled A New Way to Low, Targeting Residual Inflammatory Risk in ASCVD and CKD. I'm your host, Kim Neely, and today I'm excited to be joined by amazing faculty experts. Dr. Erin Michos is a professor of medicine, director of women's cardiovascular health, and associate director of preventive cardiology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. We also have with us Dr. Mark Sarnak, professor of medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine and chief of the Division of Nephrology at Tufts Medical Center. To find more activities on targeting residual inflammatory risk in ASCVD and CKD, including a CME certified text module with animated video and faculty voice audio clips, clinical thought commentaries, and more, visit clinicaloptions.com or visit the link in the show notes. Now I'm excited to hand it over to our guests.
Welcome back. We've been talking about inflammation on an earlier podcast, and now we're going to talk about the new and emerging anti-inflammatory agents for managing atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk, particularly in those with chronic kidney disease. So we have some exciting progress here in that we have some trials now of colchicine that have shown cardiovascular benefit. In the LDOCO-2 trial, which evaluated colchicine in statin-treated patients with chronic coronary disease, colchicine conferred a significant 31% reduction in 4-point MACE, major adverse cardiovascular events. And there's been meta-analysis that included this LDOCO-2 along with the first LDOCO trial, COLCOT, which was patients with acute coronary syndromes, and COPS, which all taken together have really shown a significant 25% reduction in cardiovascular events. And this is without any lowering in cholesterol. Now, with the caveat that you can't compare trials really head to head since there's different study populations across trials, I just want to note that this relative risk reduction that we see with this anti-inflammatory intervention with colchicine yielded a greater magnitude of benefit, a magnitude of cardiovascular risk reduction that was even greater compared to LDL lowering agents on a background of statins like PCSK9 inhibitors. And so because of these trials, colchicine, this is the low dose, the 0.5 milligram dose, was approved by the FDA as the first anti-inflammatory medication indicated for reducing cardiovascular events in patients who have established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or at high risk of developing it. And current US guidelines from the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology, as well as the European Society of Cardiology guidelines, have currently given colchicine a class 2B indication, which means it can be considered for the management of patients with chronic coronary disease. And so I consider it my patients who already are well treated with their lipids, where I've gotten their LDL well below goal, less than 70 or less than 55 for those at very high risk, but who keep having recurrent cardiovascular events despite a very good control of their LDL. If I measure the CRP and it's high, above 2, they suggest they have residual inflammatory risk. So I'm thinking about colchicine in these patients. I should note, though, because LDOCO-2 was an investigator-driven trial, sort of low budget, they actually didn't measure biomarkers in the trial. So high CRP wasn't necessarily needed to be an inclusion criteria, but we do know that colchicine does lower C-reactive protein. So we at least have something we can offer patients to target the inflammatory cascade, and colchicine's been used a long time for gout and familial Mediterranean fever. But, it has some, contraindications and concerns. It can have significant gastrointestinal side effects, and it's contraindicated in patients with pre-existing renal failure and in patients with impaired kidney function. The total clearance of colchicine is significantly reduced, and they need to be monitored closely for adverse side effects. And so there's still a need to address residual risk, particularly in patients who have chronic kidney disease where colchicine is relatively contraindicated. So in our last podcast, we talked about the inflammatory cascade, and we talked about interleukin-1 beta. And Canakinumab is a human monoclonal antibody inhibiting interleukin 1 beta. It's currently FDA approved for various serious autoimmune disorders like systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis and adult onset Still's disease. Now, it's currently not approved for ASCVD risk reduction, but it was studied in patients with ASCVD who had a prior myocardial infarction and a C-reactive protein greater than 2 on background statin therapy in the CANTOS study. And CANTOS was really a landmark trial. It really was the confirmatory proof of the inflammatory hypothesis of ASCVD because it showed that this anti-inflammatory agent, this interleukin 1 beta inhibitor, significantly reduced 3-point major adverse cardiovascular events by 15% without any impact in lipids. It conferred a 26 to 41% reduction in high sensitive CRP, it reduced interleukin 6, but again, no change in LDL, and yet still reduced cardiovascular events, really proving that you can target something other than lipids, you can target inflammation and reduce events. Now, there was a post hoc responder analysis of CANTOS where they showed that all of this cardiovascular benefit was seen in those who at 3 months on treatment had a reduction in their CRP to less than 2. So there really wasn't a cardiovascular benefit seen in patients who remained with a CRP above 2, really suggesting that you have to show documented benefit in improving inflammatory markers for them to have achieved the benefit. But again, Canakinumab is not currently approved for cardiovascular reduction in the US. There was a very small but higher incidence of fatal infections than placebo. And notably, patients excluded from CANTOS if they had significant renal impairment with an eGFR less than 30. So we still have a residual risk, a treatment gap, particularly for those with CKD. But there were patients in CANTOS who had CKD, about 1,000. I'll turn it over to Dr. Sarnak to talk about this analysis of the patients who had CKD in CANTOS.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Michos. So in a subgroup analysis of CANTOS, patients with eGFR less than 60 or CKD stage 3 or worse were evaluated. And similar to the primary results of the trial, there was a benefit of Canakinumab for reducing cardiovascular events. Interestingly, those patients whose inflammatory markers decreased had more of a benefit. In other words, if their CRP or their IL-6 dropped, those were the ones who you could see early on were going to receive some benefit from the intervention. And in those with CKD, inflammatory markers were much stronger predictors of outcomes than lipids. So in other words, if you had CKD as opposed to those with GFR greater than 60, inflammation was strongly associated with outcomes and was a marker of residual risk. Whereas in the general population, those with a GFR above 60, both inflammatory markers as well as lipid markers were associated with cardiovascular outcomes. So this suggested that, targeting inflammation in patients with CKD may be a good pathway to try and reduce residual risk in patients with CKD. So this led to the rescue study, which was a study of approximately 250 patients, all with CKD, evaluating the anti-IL-6 monoclonal antibody Ziltivekimab. And this trial was basically, the primary outcomes were evaluation of biomarkers after the intervention. And this is critical because what's been suggested thus far is if you can reduce these biomarkers of inflammation, there's a good higher probability that you're going to ultimately reduce the hard cardiovascular outcomes. And what was shown in the rescue trial was that there were significant reductions in fibrinogen, amyloid A, haptoglobin, lipoproteins in those who were treated with anti-IL-6 monoclonal antibody. So this laid the foundation for a phase 3 trial, which is currently ongoing, that will evaluate IL-6 monoclonal antibodies in reducing cardiovascular outcomes. Interestingly, in CANTOS, in the CKD group, there was no benefit on CKD progression, but this wasn't a population that was at high risk for CKD progression. In the ZEUS trial, CKD will be evaluated as a secondary outcome, so it will be interesting to see, how intervening on inflammation reduces cardiovascular outcomes as well as progression of CKD.
Okay, great. So, to recap, in RESCUE, which was a phase 2 trial of patients with CKD and CRP above 2, that Ziltivekimab, this novel IL-6 inhibitor, markedly reduced these biomarkers, systemic inflammation, thrombosis, CRP, fibrinogen, lipoprotein A, even in this critical patients of CKD who have high cardiovascular risk with this considerable unmet need. And the magnitude of change we saw with Ziltivekimab on CRP was nearly twice as large in this RESCUE trial as observed in CANTOS with Canakinumab, where we demonstrated a cardiovascular event rate. And we even get greater CRP reduction in Ziltivekimab, which is encouraging. This anti-inflammatory benefit with Ziltivekimab, this IL-6 inhibitor, was achieved with really minimal evidence of bone marrow suppression, infectious risk, hepatic toxicity, or change in atherogenic lipid levels. We always have some concern with things that target the immune system about increased risk of infection. We did see that with Canakinumab. So far, the safety signal has been good with Ziltivekimab, with ongoing trials further addressing this. So those phase 2 trials really suggested that Ziltivekimab may be unique and strongly supports its use potentially in these cardiovascular outcome trials. So as alluded to, these trials are ongoing. There's sort of 3 cardiovascular outcome trials. ZEUS, as you heard about, is evaluating Ziltivekimab, which is dosed 15 milligrams subcutaneously once a month versus placebo in patients who have cardiovascular disease and kidney disease and systemic inflammation with a CRP above 2. Everybody's on statins and standard of care. And this is an event-driven trial for major cardiovascular outcomes, and the trial will conclude when enough events have been achieved. And so this is enrolled and ongoing, so we anxiously await the outcomes. Now, there's some other trials ongoing. There's the Artemis trial that's evaluating Ziltivekimab in patients with acute myocardial infarction. So where ZEUS is looking at stable cardiovascular disease. It's also being investigated in the acute phase after a recent acute MI. And then the Hermes trial is evaluating Ziltivekimab in patients with heart failure with mildly reduced or preserved ejection fraction above 40% who have CRP above 2. We think that inflammation is not only a driver in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, but may also contribute to the pathogenesis of heart failure. So it's being evaluated in these patients with HFpEF as well. So exciting trials are ongoing that'll be really informative and may change the landscape of what we can offer patients in the future.
Yes, I agree. A very exciting time in kidney disease. Kidney disease always been associated with very bad prognosis, as you said, in CKD3, 20-fold higher mortality due to cardiovascular disease than progression of kidney disease. And we've slowly introducing treatments that are reducing the risk, but we still have a long way to go. And inflammation has always been thought of as a primary driver of kidney disease progression and cardiovascular disease. So using these interventions, even in dialysis patients, we're doing trials. So I think it's an exciting time in the kidney space.
Well, great. I think that's a great way to close out our program. And we anxiously await the outcome results for these patients with CKD who are at very high cardiovascular risk, who still have a very large unmet need, and who are relatively contraindicated for colchicine. So we await other therapies that can hopefully intervene in this space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dr. Michos and Dr. Sarnak for joining us for this very important discussion about addressing residual inflammatory risk in patients with ASCVD and CKD to improve outcomes. And thank you for listening. As a reminder, visit the episode notes or clinicaloptions.com to find more educational activities.